Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter and on Instagram at Hawk Blogger. And we're starting it's kind of the start of the week, the post Memorial Day, Tuesday, after your barbecues, after probably a lot to drink and a lot to eat. We start the work week and could not figure a better way to do that than to bring our good friend Brady Henderson onto the show from ESPN.com. Brady, how are you doing? How did you spend your Memorial Day?
What's up, Brian? Thanks for having me. How did I spend my Memorial Day? I did a lot of golfing. Yeah, with a little bit of work mixed in there, but I played golf on Saturday, Sunday, and yesterday. The Saturday round was 5:30 round, and we only did that because the guy who booked it, it was his birthday, and so nobody felt like pushing back on 5:30 a.m. So, but I'm caught up on my sleep. I'm ready to talk Seahawks. How'd you spend it?
Well, did a lot of podcasting actually, and then a lot of time with family. My oldest son drove up with his friends, so hung out with them for a little bit. Introduced his friends to Matador Nachos on I think it was Saturday night. So yeah, it was a good weekend. It was a lot of fun, and looking forward to the week ahead. I got to ask, where were your rounds? Where'd you play?
Played Jefferson Saturday morning. Played Rainier Sunday. I got a buddy who's a member out there. And then yesterday, why am I drawing a blank on it? We played, oh my gosh, this is embarrassing. My brain must not be working right now.
Public, private?
Public. I got so many freaking golf courses running through my head.
That's okay.
We played Druids Glen.
Druids Glen. I was about to ask. Yeah. That was the first one I was thinking about. Yeah. Well, the weather largely cooperated, so glad you got those in. And I was kind of curious because, being a beat writer for an NFL team, how similar is that to being a school teacher? Like, is this summer break for you?
Not quite. The true summer break comes in like the 5-6 weeks between mid-June and late July, when like basically the NFL shuts down. There's actually, interestingly, I said Tom Pelissero tweeted something this morning about how the PA is proposing rearranging the entire offseason so that there would be no OTAs, but then there would be a bigger ramp up to training camp. So at least for now, the real summer break is late June and then most of July until training camp starts. But you do get plenty of windows before then, like this time of the year. It gets obviously really busy around free agency, and then there's the ramp up to the draft, and then the week or two after the draft, you've got the rookie mini camp. But then after that, it's kind of sporadic, just because I think nowadays, and the Seahawks do this. I don't know if every other team does this, but the Seahawks only let us watch 3 of the 10 OTAs. So they'll have OTAs, but 7 of them we're not out there for them, and so it's really the 3 OTAs, the 3 days of veteran mini camp. And then aside from that, you're just sort of working from home or taking a vacation in between times you got to go out to VMAC.
Yeah, I was looking at this because you mentioned the Pelissero tweet about, you're basically talking about consolidating all these OTAs into just an extended, training camp. And that's the Players Association's proposal. And the Seahawks, if I'm right, looking at this, their OTA offseason workouts, it's like May 20th, then the 22nd to the 23rd, then the 28th, then the 30th to the 31st, then June 3rd to 4th, then June 6th, 7th. It's this really weird, like, on again, off again. But when I've talked to players, even when it's not officially OTAs, they kind of call it that. They're at the VMAC, they're working out, doing stuff. Not all of them, but like, what is that like? What do you know? Like, is it basically like those are the days they can actually go on the field to practice? Or when these?
Yeah, the OTAs and player. I've heard the same thing. Players kind of refer generally to like this part of the off season as OTAs, but I think there are days before they actually start the OTAs. They're out there, doing stuff on the field. I think what separates an OTA from the other stuff that happens before that is it's more like a structured practice, whereas the stuff before that is there's no offense versus defense. For the initial part of it, the coaches can't even be on the field other than like the strength and conditioning coaches. And you can't do, I think quarterbacks can only throw to receivers, and then the defensive backs like can't make plays on the ball or something. So the stuff that happens before OTAs is not like a practice, whereas the OTAs, that's when you start getting into what looks like a normal NFL practice. And I think the reason why you're hearing this come out about how the players maybe want to just push basically all of this until later in the summer is, a lot of these guys live elsewhere in the off season. And so they're kind of flying back and forth. So they fly up here for OTAs, then maybe they go home, then they fly back up here for mini camp, then back home, then back for training camp. So I wonder if this is the players just saying, hey, just give us like a longer, more consistent off season. If they're going to be required to be at the facility the same number of days, then you might as well just bundle it all into one bigger training camp and give them the rest of the off season.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned that there's only a few days where media is invited in. We've had one of those days so far. Is that right? So there's two more to go?
Yeah, it was last Wednesday. The next one is this Thursday, and then the third one is TBD.
Okay,
or
got
TBA.
Got it. So this Thursday will be another day open to the media where there'll be more interviews. That'll be interesting to listen to. And one more question on that, I guess. Does the press pool request who comes to speak, or is it basically just whoever Dave Pearson and the PR team decides is who you guys get as like the player speakers or coach speakers or anything like that?
Yeah, it's more of the latter. And they'll usually do a good job. Like if we haven't heard from somebody all off season or in a while, and we, request them, or multiple people request them, they're usually pretty good about making them available. But it's more so, who they want to put up there. Typically it aligns just because they're putting people up there that, we want to talk to and we haven't heard from in a while. Really would like to hear from Ryan Grubb and Sam Howell. We haven't heard from Howell since the trade went down, and we've only heard from Ryan Grubb, I think, in his introductory press conference. So he's one guy, Grubb, that I'm really interested to hear more from, and just to see how things are coming along. And then Sam Howell as well. I'm curious just to hear him for the first time. I know he did a radio interview, but we haven't had a chance to talk to him. And from the sounds of it, I mean, that was a very big acquisition. At least they think so, but we've yet to hear from him.
Yeah, I definitely, the part of the reason I was asking is because we haven't heard anything from Ryan Grubb. Like, he is such a key part of this deal.
Yeah.
And also Scott Huff is a key part of this deal. And it leads into what I think we'll talk about here in a second. You wrote an article about the offensive line. The offensive line is linchpin. I mean, in any NFL team, but for this team, it has absolutely been a millstone around the neck of the offense for like a better part of a decade. And there's hope that Scott Huff is part of the turnaround there, but like there's been no opportunity to kind of hear anything from either Grubb or Huff on, the state of things there. So let's do this. Let's talk about the offense and the offensive line. You wrote recently about it, and I'm curious what was the impetus for you to write the article up there on ESPN.com?
Just, you're going through different position groups and different storylines. And this, I felt like, was a big one that I hadn't really hit on. I mean, I wrote the individual stories on, they drafted Christian Haynes and then they signed Laken Tomlinson. But it felt like it was worth a bigger piece, just kind of looking where that entire group stands right now. And also really in the context of, Gino Smith. And typically, what they tell us at ESPN is that stories purely about offensive lines really don't move the needle at ESPN.com. I'm sure that's probably the case anywhere. And so, generally we don't write about offensive lines unless it's in the context of something bigger. And in this case, it's in the context of Gino Smith. And that's not like I didn't have to do much of a detour to work both storylines in. I mean, they are very much tied to each other. And I think that the lead of the story was a comment that I heard from somebody from the coaching staff last season who was basically, I was asking a lot of these guys like, hey, what did you think of Gino? What did you think of his season? And one of the comments I heard was he didn't have a clean pocket all year. Obviously that's an exaggeration, but we all saw that this was not a good offensive line last year. Maybe if healthy, they would have been fine. But we know that they weren't healthy, and we know that they had to play a lot of young players and didn't really have a true difference maker. With Abe Lucas missing more than half the season, they just didn't really have any elite talent there. And so I think they're going to be better this season. Certainly, if Abe Lucas is back and if he can stay healthy, I think they're going to be better. I don't know if you could say that the spots that they swapped out are like, I don't know if Laken Tomlinson is a better player right now than Damian Lewis. Certainly a lot better value, I would guess. Don't know if Oluwatimi is going to be a lot better than Evan Brown. We'll see. Same thing with Christian Haynes over, Anthony Bradford / Phil Haynes. But I think getting Lucas back would be the biggest difference maker possible. And also getting some coaches in here who have a pretty good track record of coaching some good offensive lines at UW.
Let's talk about Abe Lucas. You had I think, a quote in there for those starving for Seahawks news, especially around the offensive line. All eyes are on Abe Lucas. And there was, a comment last year from Pete Carroll, just a single word that sent shivers down the spine of every Seahawks fan, and it was chronic. And you had some new updates there. I'm curious what you can share about Abe Lucas from what you've heard.
Yeah, so from what I've been told, that there isn't as big of a fear inside the building that this is going to be some like major long-term thing, at least compared to, again, what a lot of people, myself included, thought when we heard the word chronic, because chronic typically implies, or it could imply, an injury that may not necessarily get better with surgery. That was Pete Carroll saying that. He's obviously not a doctor, and the word itself does, it's not necessarily like a, definitive, clearly defined word medically. And so what I've been told is that now that he has had surgery, there's not as much concern about the long term, but it has taken Lucas longer than he's wanted to bounce back from surgery, and he's kind of been frustrated by that. And so we heard Mike McDonald after that first open OTA last week say that I think he said it's hard to say when he's going to be back, or it's hard to say exactly how he's doing right now, but they still are shooting for training camp. So yeah, I mean, there is, I think there could still be reason to have some concern about it just because he's not back yet. But that was what I was heard, is that now that he had surgery, at least inside the building, there wasn't as much concern about this being a recurring long-term issue.
That is big news for the Seahawks. And part of what makes that really interesting and important news is that I was looking at this, at least from PFF, and there is a stat that they have, which is allowed pressure, and they attribute who is responsible for the pressure to a position on the offensive line or the quarterback. And like Russell Wilson led the NFL, 25%, 24% of the pressures he experienced were his own doing. Gino Smith was 35th in the NFL. 6% of the pressures that they calculated were attributed to Gino Smith, where the Seahawks ranked number 1 in percentage of pressures allowed by a position was right tackle, and it was by a mile. 38% of the pressures came from the right tackle position. That was a massive jump from the year before, where they were like, I want to say, I can look it up, but it was much, much, much lower. They were probably in the 20s in terms of where they ranked. So Abe Lucas feels like a big deal. George Fant feels like a big deal relative to who they had there last year. But the other part of this is Charles Cross. And Charles Cross gave up the 12th highest percentage of pressures among left tackles in the NFL. And almost none of the offenses that had left tackles that were giving up pressures like that were particularly functional. So I'm curious if you're hearing anything, if you're getting any, if you've seen anything, if you look at Charles Cross, there's some like, oh, he's a little bigger this year. Any news there that would give any reason to feel more optimistic or pessimistic about where he is coming into his third year?
No, he's not one of the guys that I've really had my eye on. That I had my eye on during that one open practice that we saw. I did hear the same thing you did about him looking bigger, maybe in a little better shape. This is obviously a really big year for him, knowing that, they next offseason, around this time next year, or 11 months from now, I guess, would be when they would have to decide on whether or not to pick up his 5th-year option. And that's typically a pretty big, pretty big indicator of how a team is feeling about a guy's progress after 3 years. And so I think the interesting thing about Cross is he hasn't been, I wouldn't say he's been bad. I'd say he's been average. He's certainly been better, a lot better than the 2 tackles that were drafted ahead of him in 2022. That was Evan Neal and Ikem Ekwonu. I think I'm saying the name right. So those were the 2 guys that were drafted before him who have not worked out at all. But the standard shouldn't be how are you relative to the guys in the draft or relative to the guys that drafted around you. It's how are you relative to where you were drafted, the 9th overall pick. And I think when you draft a guy inside the top 10, a fair expectation is for that guy to be playing at a Pro Bowl level, 2-3 years into that contract. And we have yet to see that, maybe in flashes, but we've yet to see that. I wondered how last season with Lucas not being out, if that maybe put a little more pressure on him, maybe, I don't know how that would have worked, but you would sort of think it would be the opposite, where teams would put their better rushers on the other side of him, knowing that they got a much better matchup. So I don't know if that had something to do with it, but I think it's time for him to take the next step, and we'll see if he can do that. I think the one interesting thing about this new coaching staff, and just in the context of like the offensive line, you could look at the new pieces they have player wise. I think you also got to look at what the coaches could bring and what the coaches could do to help these guys out and mitigate some of the youth, some of the inconsistency. So during Ryan Grubb's 2 seasons as Washington's offensive coordinator, UW had the 2nd lowest rate of sacks per dropback in FBS. So 1.6, which is very low. And they had the 10th lowest pressure rate allowed in FBS. So that's over the 2 seasons that Ryan Grubb was at UW. Obviously, they had a couple of very good offensive linemen and Troy Fatanu and Roger Rosengarten. But, you also had 3 other guys out there that you got to account for. And so I think that's a pretty strong indicator of, I think, what kind of coaches they could have now. And so that is maybe one reason for hope that they could, mitigate some of that youth and some of that inexperience that we've seen out of that group.
Yeah, well, and Ryan Grubb, one of the first players he mentioned in his press conference was Charles Cross, and indicated that he thought very highly. It seems like he's got a high ceiling, or I can't remember what it was, but it was a pretty glowing initial comment. So I'm hoping that when you guys eventually do get a chance to talk to him, that we'll hear a little bit more a question about where he sees the offensive line and how he sees that progressing. Sticking with the offensive line for a little bit longer, some news there was also the depth chart. Kind of like, obviously it's very early and we see these things change massively, but from what I understood, it sounded like Fant was at right tackle and McClendon Curtis was at right guard. And so I want to ask you a little bit of whether there's any reason to think like this McClendon Curtis thing could be more than just early depth chart, finagling with a guy that's been there. And then it sounded like with the second unit, it was Christian Haynes at right guard, Mike Jarrell and Garrett Greenfield alternating at right tackle. It sounded like Satola Mea was 3rd string, but I wasn't exactly sure where he was playing. So those are a couple questions kind of bundled in there. Feel free to pick out any in whatever order work for you.
Yeah, sure. I apologize. I don't have my notebook in front of me, so I don't recall off the top of my head where Laumea was, but it definitely was Haynes at right guard with the number 2 offensive line. And you had McClendon Curtis at right guard with the number 1s. Now, one point there, so Anthony Bradford wasn't practicing because he had tweaked his ankle, and it sounds like he's going to be fine, won't be out long. But I wonder if he would have been in that number 1 spot had it not been for that, just because we saw him make 10 starts there. Granted, he was pretty inconsistent, and that's a big reason why everybody expected them to draft at least 1 guard, and why they did in the 3rd round. I still, if I'm guessing right now on May 28th, I think Christian Haynes is going to be the starter. Granted, I've seen him practice once. I just know that he's 24 years old, so he's going to be more mature mentally and physically than your average rookie. He's made 49 starts at right guard, so his experience matches up perfectly with the hole that they have there, the opening that they have there, I should say. And McClendon Curtis, he might end up being a player for them. I've heard every time I've talked to somebody there about the offensive line, they bring him up as A guy who obviously was a tackle, and now they're moving him inside to guard. But that, he's played more tackle, I think, than guard throughout his career. So he's going up against a guy who made 49 starts at right guard. And the fact that they drafted him in the third round, my guess is that Christian Haynes eventually overtakes both those guys, and that he's their opening day starter at right guard.
Who do you think is really in competition with Laken Tomlinson at left guard? Will Bradford potentially move that direction? Will, Lamea or any of the other guys potentially go over on that side?
Yeah, maybe Curtis. I don't know how how much they would want Bradford playing on the left side. I haven't heard anything yes or no regarding that. I just know that he played exclusively right guard last year, and so typically guys, as you know, are able to kind of flip flop back and forth, but sometimes guys are just way more comfortable on one side. So my guess would be McClendon Curtis and maybe even Nick Harris. They signed Nick Harris with the thought that he was going to compete at center, but then also that he could play guard if they needed him to. And so, maybe him and Laumea would also be in that mix. But just the fact that they put Curtis there as the number one guy, at least for that one day we saw last week, that would tell me that would suggest to me at least that he would be kind of the top guy competing with Tomlinson at left guard. Now, Tomlinson is, I think he's going to start, but that's not, they didn't give him a contract that was like, guaranteed starter money. I mean, it was a very team friendly deal. I think it was 1.21 million with 500,000 guaranteed, and it can be worth up to 4 million in incentives. But a lot of those incentives are playing time based. And so he would really have to earn that money by starting and playing a lot. But as of right now, it's just a 1 year, $1.2 million deal with 500,000 guaranteed.
You got some more time? Can I bend your ear for a little while longer?
Yeah,
all right.
Let's do it.
Cool.
We got to go to commercial break first. Is that how this works?
Well, let's do a commercial break. I do want to thank a new YouTube member who joined at the start of the show, Lucas Grand. Great to have you. Everyone can join as YouTube member. The link is pinned in the chat and it's in the description of the video. Brady Henderson gets none of the profits. So thank you for coming on. Neither do I, as a matter of fact. All goes to charity. We're making our next donation in August. So now's the time to help increase that donation. All right. So I could keep going on the offensive line, but as you said, maybe not the most interesting topic to most people. It's just very, very important.
Yeah.
What else did you walk away with from observations in terms of observations from OTAs, whether it's players that looked different, whispers you heard, things you observed? Like what kind of jumped out to you from this last OTA?
Yeah, one thing was just the quarterback play. And, there has been some conversation. I was on a radio station a week or two ago, and we sort of got into it about, the hosts were of the opinion that the Seahawks should open up the quarterback competition between Gino Smith.
I know exactly which host you're talking about.
Yeah, and Sam Howell. And I said, no, not so fast. So I just think that the Sam Howell acquisition was more of a long-term move than a move for the here and the now. He's 24 years old or 23 years old, 2 years left on his rookie contract. And look, I didn't watch a whole lot of Sam Howell games last year outside of the one that the Seahawks where they hosted Washington. But I know just based on what I've seen from Gino Smith and what the numbers say about their respective QBRs that right now Gino Smith is clearly the better quarterback. And again, Sam Howell's young. He may end up being the better quarterback in not too long. But right now, Gino Smith is clearly the better quarterback. And by the way, you're trying to install a new offense, and the quarterback needs every rep he can get in that new offense to try to gain comfort in it, try to gain understanding of it. And I just think that if you open up that to a quarterback competition, you're really just doing that for the sake of competition, and you're going to end up with the same result either way, which is that Gino Smith would prove to be the better option. And all you would have done in the meantime is cost him reps, trying to learn that new offense that he really needs. And so and I'm not like, that was my opinion before seeing the first open OTA. I totally reserve the right to change my mind. If Sam Howell, balls out and it looks like he really could push Gino Smith for the starting job and he looks like he could be an upgrade, then I would say, yeah, open it up. But nothing that I saw last Wednesday would lead me to think that that's anything close to reality. I mean, there was one stretch where he got picked off and then he threw behind a receiver, and I think that was on consecutive plays. And remember, this is the time of the offseason where offensive skill players, quarterbacks and receivers, are set up to shine. I mean, first of all, in practice, there's never any true pressure. And second of all, this time of the year, because it's non-contact, the defensive backs aren't even making plays on the ball. So they basically concede almost every completion. And yet there was one pick he had threw to a receiver who was falling down. And then another one he threw, I think it was behind a guy who was running a crosser. So look, I'm not saying based on one series of plays that I saw from Sam Howell where he'd like to have back that he's not going to be a good quarterback. I just say right now, let's pump the brakes on the thought that they should open up this to a quarterback competition. I don't think that would do them any favors.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a confusing part of the whole offseason from my perspective, and I think we've seen it boil over a little bit on social media for Gino in terms of frustration about the reports that keep coming out from different places about that this is more of a competition than people realize. Never made sense to me why they wouldn't just say, we're going to have one of the best offenses in football. We have one of the best quarterbacks in football. Even if you don't fully believe that, there's no downside to taking that path. And then if Sam Howell ends up just overtaking him, great. All the same things could happen. But that way you've built up your starter, you've given him confidence, you've talked up the offense. But instead, they've created this air of question with the way that they initially talked about Drew Lock a lot, more than they talked about Gino Smith and then the Sam Howell stuff. So I think it's a little bit of a self-created problem that they've done. Yeah. And I wouldn't put this in the same category, but I'm curious your thoughts. One little tidbit of comment from Mike McDonald last week was, it was very positive about Gino, but he was like, we're asking Gino to take the next step. And he talked about as a leader. I think he said on the field. What do you think he means by next step?
Yeah, as soon as you started saying that, I kind of knew that's where your mind was going. And I thought that was curious as well, because it was part of a larger, praising comment about Gino Smith. Now, that's definitely going to require a follow-up to Mike McDonald at some point. I think right now what he means is, I'll just back up and tell you what I've heard about Gino. So, from different people I've talked to who were on the coaching staff last year and just with the team last year, there's one I talked to who said, they are super impressed by the way Gino, after a game when it was clear that everything was going haywire around him, the offensive line, whatever, receivers dropping balls, running wrong routes, whatever it was, that he would take all the arrows. Like when talking to reporters, he would say, yeah, put that on me. And he would point the thumb right back at himself. The person I talked to said they were super impressed by how he would do that. But there was a thought that maybe in the heat of the moment, that he could do that a little bit more. And not maybe get in guys' faces to the degree that he does, or not, sulk on the sidelines. And we've heard Pete Carroll say that he's like a very emotional player. I think Pete Carroll said hot-headed at one point was the way he described him. You don't really see a whole lot of that on the TV copy. You do see a little bit of it, but I've just heard that is a way that's a bigger thing than maybe people realize, that he's very emotional in the moment. And I think what Mike McDonald was saying, again, this is just a guess, I think what he was saying is they want him to maybe control his emotions a little bit better, maybe be a little more accountable in the moment, the way that he is, in the post-game press conferences. And again, that's not meant to be like any sort of major criticism of him, because again, the person I talked to said it's super impressive how much he does take accountability, when he's talking to reporters afterwards. But I think there's a thought that maybe he could do that a little bit more in the moment.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, speaking of pressure, and just how he handles things and how emotional he is. One of the other things I looked up yesterday is Gino Smith, when under pressure, and this was not specific to any down. This is just any time when he's under pressure, at least from a PFF standpoint, his passer grade was 9th best in the NFL. So top 10, but still his actual grade was 57.2, which is not good. Patrick Mahomes is the best, and it's 69.1, which is still not that good. Any quarterback under pressure is not great. But if you go to when he's not under pressure, when he's kept clean, Gino Smith had the fifth highest grade, 91.3. And so I think that there's this, I think there's a misnomer among fans not understanding some of what they're seeing, that he is a quarterback that is very clearly impacted. Like his variance with pressure is probably greater than most quarterbacks. Mm-hmm. And the percentage of plays where he is under pressure is just much higher than other quarterbacks at this point. So you're seeing a lot more of that lower graded passer than, you'd like to see. And so that's why we obviously start with the offensive line. And this is also something I think I could talk to you about a little bit, that first and second down, he was one of the best passers in football last year. When it came to third down, he wasn't. And I think you dug up some numbers on this as well, that his QBR, the difference between his QBR and third down when he's under pressure versus his QBR when he's not is a pretty massive difference.
Yeah. So third down? So overall on third down, his QBR is 51.7, which is 21st in the NFL. When pressured, again, this is on third down, he is 16th in the NFL, 16.6. So that drops quite a bit. And as you said, every quarterback is going to be way better when they're not pressured and way worse when they are pressured. Third down, when not pressured, that goes all the way up to 78.7. So that's good enough for 13th in the NFL. Now, just to put in context, 78.7, that would rank, I think, 4th in terms of overall QBR. So 78.7, you're playing at a very high level there when not pressured. Again, it's only 13th in the NFL, just because that speaks to how most quarterbacks are, quite a bit better when they're not pressured. But there is a huge difference there. And to your point, he was pressured a whole lot last season. And it was not a coincidence that, towards the end of the season, they had this aha moment. I don't know why it took them 2/3 of the way through the season to realize this, but they had this aha moment where they said, hey, you got to get the ball out quicker. And so I think they started really hammering that into Gino Smith. They started calling plays accordingly. And it was really in the Dallas game. They obviously lost that game, but that might have been Gino Smith's best game of the season, notwithstanding, the end where, they had those fourth down plays that didn't work out. But by and large, he was very good in that game. And that was the beginning of a trend in which he was getting the ball out a lot quicker than he was over the first, 2/3 of the season. And over those final 6 weeks, obviously he missed 2 games in that stretch, but over those final 6 weeks, I think it was week 13 on, he had the best QBR in the NFL. And if you look, like, his time before throw during that stretch was a lot quicker than it was over the first 12 weeks of the season.
Yeah, really, really well said and backed up with data. That was very, very obvious. The Dallas game was, I think, the first game where that really seemed like they had made that switch. And I'm curious, that leads me to some questions about this roster. One of the things that caught my eye was the Laviska Shenault signing. It's kind of a quieter signing, and there's a lot of reason to think it's, maybe he doesn't even make the team. Who knows? But his whole game, there was a 2022, not 2023, but 2022, his average depth of target was negative. This is a guy that catches the ball behind the line of scrimmage. Mm-hmm. His whole game is around like yards after catch. And the Seahawks didn't really have a guy like that for the last few years. JSN, they kind of tried to use that way, but he's not really made for it. D. Eskridge was a guy that was supposed to potentially be a yard after catch kind of guy. And there continues to be, when I talk to Trey Brown or Jarek Reed, like, a lot of people still talk about D. Eskridge as a guy to watch. Do you get any sense that, we saw Ryan Grubb do a lot of bubble screens and wide receiver kind of screens, plays with yards after catch at Washington. Do you get any sense that that's going to be a part of this plan, and that those kind of players might be a bigger part of the offense than maybe people realize?
Yeah, I think it's TBD with Shenault. He is on, I think, a minimum salary deal, so there's not a whole lot invested in him. But, the thing he's got going for him is the return ability as well. I should say the other thing that he's got going for him is the return ability. And as we know, the new kickoff rules, I think, are going to have teams put 2 returners back there. So that could mean that the guy who was, fighting for a roster spot as a returner, he might be, a lot more likely to make the team, knowing that they've got to have 2 of those guys. But I think the interesting thing about Chenault's career is that as a receiver, like, he started out pretty well. His first 2 years, he had 600 receiving yards and 619 receiving yards in 14 and 16 games, respectively. He had 5 touchdowns as a rookie. So this is a guy who not all that long ago was a productive wide receiver, in addition to being, having some kickoff return ability. And so, again, I think the contract clearly states that he's not any sort of stone cold lock to make the team, but the return ability, and I think the run after the catch ability, and that's why they're giving him a look at kick returner, is just, he's a guy that, as you said, you get the ball in his hands in space, and he's got the potential to make something happen. I think, he's competing for that 4th wide receiver spot with, I would say, with D. Eskridge and Jake Bobo. And as you know, I'm a Bobo guy. I'm not a fan, but I am a Bobo guy. He's going to have to prove everything all over again, because everything he did last season under, that old coaching staff, that doesn't carry a whole lot of weight now. So I wouldn't assume that he's, a lock to make the team or a lock to find a role, just because he's going to have to prove himself all over again to a new coaching staff.
Brady, any rookies, whether undrafted free agents or drafted players, that either caught your eye or that you've heard like, hey, keep an eye on this guy, he's looking promising?
Not off the top of my head, no. Just because, again, we've just had the 1 full team practice, and then I think there was only the 2 rookie mini camp practices, and a lot of the guys they drafted are linemen who you can't really tell much about in that kind of setting, anyways. I think one guy who I haven't even seen practice yet, but looks like he could be something, is AJ Barner, and I say that just because physically, even without a helmet on and without pads, he just stands out from everybody just physically. I'm very curious to see what he looks like when the pads come on and he's running routes. I know the 40 time wasn't all that impressive, but I have heard that they had him on, like, the GPS tracker. They had him, their GPS data on him would suggest that he's a lot faster than the 40 time would suggest. And I think that was what Mike McDonald meant when he said after the draft that, I think he called him like an underrated athlete. I think that's what he was getting at, is that some of the GPS tracking time suggests that he's faster than what was, I think, just kind of a 40. But yeah, he's a guy I'm very curious to see once they start, actually throwing the ball to him, once he gets on the field, what that looks like.
A couple others, and I'll let you get back to your day. Anything that stood out to you about either Mike McDonald, now that he's doing these press conferences more often and as a coach on the field of practice, and then 2, maybe the way any differences? I everyone talks about the music. Honestly, I don't care about the music, but like the way the OTAs were run or set up. Anything else that stood out to you about Mike McDonald in this period?
We may have talked about this last time, I can't remember, but he just seems so much more comfortable in, like, the post-practice interview setting than he does, like post-draft when he's sitting next to Schneider. I don't know, maybe it's just something about being on the field. He just, I don't know, he just seems way more at ease, and he's, cracking jokes, and he just seems natural. I think if fans are going to training camp and have done that like a few times in the past, I think they're just going to be struck by how different the practice looks drill wise, just because they're doing a lot of drills that I never saw them do before. The music, it's not as loud, but I think that may not be a philosophical thing so much as it is a function of the fact that, they're installing a new offense and a new defense, and they got all these rookies on the field. And I think they're just more in teaching mode right now than they are trying to simulate an actual game. So I don't know what the music situation is going to be when training camp starts and they're actually more in, getting into regular season mode. One thing I have noticed, and this is purely anecdotal based off of 3 practices I've been out there, but it does seem like the coaches, and again, this is an all new coaching staff, I think, except for one person, Carl Scott. The coaches, my initial impression is that they're a little bit saltier than the other guys, and not necessarily them personality wise, but they're a little bit more willing to chew guys out and to really coach them in a way that I didn't always hear under Pete Carroll. Now, I don't think Pete Carroll ever told his coaches, hey, you can't swear, you gotta be clean, like clean language. I think I always got the impression that he told those guys that, look, you're going to get more out of players when you're a teacher as opposed to like a drill sergeant, and I don't know, I've heard some language and some coaching that would probably be more towards the drill sergeant side of the spectrum. Nothing terrible, but just, it seems like coaches are a little bit more willing to get on guys than I remember the old coaching staff being under Pete Carroll.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to watch. I know some people are going to mourn that change because they really valued that kind of positive coaching mentality that Pete Carroll brought. But I think there's a lot of folks that are going to look forward to maybe this, at least the notion of more accountability in that regard. And we'll find out how that all plays out. One thing I doubt maybe maybe you don't, but I don't assume that Mike McDonald is going to allow the fans to come to training camp the way that they've done for the past however many years with the Seahawks. And as of now, I don't think the Seahawks have announced their training camp dates, and they certainly haven't opened it up for fans to buy tickets to attend like they've done in the past. Do you have any insights there or any thoughts about what might happen there?
Nothing that I've heard. No, I haven't heard that they're thinking about not doing that. So until I hear any whispers otherwise, I would assume that they would have fans. I think most teams do that, right? I actually don't know that. Do you know if other teams, if some other teams close their training camp practices?
I think it's mixed, and I think there's some places that'll do like one or a couple, as opposed to, there was for a while a lot of the training camp practice, pretty much all the practices before the first preseason game were, generally open to Seahawks fans under Pete Carroll. So yeah, I don't know, like it varies, but I don't know all the details for all the other teams. And Mike McDonald made a comment about, having guests at practice, and that was just reporters. And it just makes me wonder a little bit about how he's going to feel about having open practices for all the fans.
Yeah, we'll see. I haven't heard anything suggesting otherwise, but yeah, I'll keep my ears open to that possibility. And I know they've done it for so many years, and they make such a big production out of it. You've been there a number of times. Like, I think the organization really enjoys doing that. Obviously, they're going to defer to what the head coach wants, but yeah, that's an interesting possibility that I hadn't really thought of.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, Brady, anything else that I have not brought up that has been on your mind relative to the Seahawks?
I think we covered quite a bit of ground here. I think the one thing is, and going back to the Sam Howell conversation, and the fact that we have not heard from him yet. One of the reasons I'm interested in hearing from him is I just want to see what kind of command he has, and just what the personality is. And I've talked to Brock Heward about this before. Now, Brock obviously played at UW. His nephew spent a little bit of time at UW. His nephew is a quarterback, Sam Heward, who spent some time at UW under Ryan Grubb. And the thing I heard from Brock was that Grubb really demands presence from his quarterbacks. And I'm sure every coach, every offensive coordinator would want that, but it sounds like he demands it and he preaches it to, a greater degree than most. And so when we talked to Gino Smith the other day, I asked him, what does Ryan Grubb demand from you guys leadership wise? And he used that same word, presence. And, anybody who's been in a press conference or seen a press conference with Gino Smith knows that he's got that, man. And whatever, whatever holes you want to poke in like his game, and maybe even in, as we talked about, in the leadership style, whatever holes you want to poke in that, like when you talk to him and you hear from him in a press conference setting, you're talking to an NFL quarterback who's been there, who's done it, and who's comfortable in that setting. And he's got that presence, I think, that Ryan Grubb talks about. And I'm curious whether or not Sam Howell has that. And that's not to say that if he doesn't have it right now, he can't develop it. And he's only 23 years old. he's in a new setting. So maybe there's a little bit of comfort that he's got to gain, but I'm just curious to see what that presence looks like and sounds like with him compared to Gino, knowing how important it is for the offensive coordinator.
Yeah, that'll definitely be one to watch. I actually just this weekend heard a report. I'll have to remember which podcast I was listening to, but that it was credible enough that I'm willing to mention it, that part of Washington's calculus for trading Sam Howell was that he was too much of an alpha to be a backup in their locker room, and that too many of the players would kind of align to him, and potentially make it hard for a rookie to come in and take over. That's one report. Who knows how credible that is? But I mention it because it's so different than what I think is started to gain some steam in Seattle circles. Like his one interview Sam Howell had was with Brock and Salk, and it wasn't particularly impressive. It was pretty low energy, and I think a lot of people are like, "Oh, this guy's not the guy." So yeah, it is worth kind of keeping an eye on that. And if this report is true, that'd be a fascinating dynamic. I don't think Gino is going to be threatened by an alpha QB behind him, but I guess we'll have to see.
Yeah, so I heard something similar from our guy in Washington, John Keim, who covers the team for ESPN.com, but that was more in the context of not so much that he's too much of an alpha male, but that was in the context of they might have drafted Drake May. That was still in the period where it was uncertain whether it would be Jane Daniels or Drake May going at that spot. And the thought was that because Howell and May were teammates at UNC, that might be kind of awkward and it might be difficult. Now, the other part of it was that I didn't hear the term alpha male, but I heard that Sam Howell was very well liked in that locker room and very well respected because of how the toughness that he showed last season, getting beat to hell behind that offensive line and answering the bell every time, and and just standing in the pocket and all that. And that I heard that there could have been conceivably some concern about players on that offense being loyal to Sam Howell because of how much grit he showed, and maybe not embracing the new quarterback as much. And certainly if that was Drake May, that might add another layer to that. But I didn't necessarily hear that in the context of him being like this alpha male presence. So again, it'll be interesting to see and hear from Sam Howell, knowing all of that, knowing what Grubb wants out of his guys.
It makes me laugh a little, Brady. I'm thinking from two perspectives. Sam Howell must have thought, so I just got sacked 1,000 times behind a crappy offensive line, and I get traded where? to Seattle and that offensive line. And Schneider must be like, hey, here's a quarterback that can take a lot of sacks. He'll fit in perfectly here. So we'll see. Let's hope that Sam Howell does not earn his teammates' respect by how much he puts up with physical beatings from his offensive line not doing their job. Let's hope he stands out for other reasons. But look, Tavares Jackson back in the day earned a ton of respect from his teammates because of playing through injury and the physical way that he approached the game. So RIP for Tavares, but it definitely does matter on the football field. Brady, this has been great to have you, man. Always great to have you, and hope that you get as many more golf outings as you can under the belt as the offseason kind of trickles on.
Somehow, some way, Brian, I will find a way to do that. I can promise you that.
Okay.
Thanks for
having me. Yeah, thank you. Everybody, that's Brady Henderson at ESPN.com. And we will say thank you and move on for the rest of the show. A lot to chew on there from Brady. And I think the fact that he talked about the changes that we've seen at practice, kind of interesting. First time we've heard that. A little bit more saltiness is how he described it. A little bit more cussing, I think was the way he described it in practice. And we'll see. I mean, that's certainly not unique. What was unique was the way Pete Carroll approached things, where he was very much about creating, performance psychology, positive visioning, building people up and not tearing them down kind of approach. the vast majority of the NFL is not that way. So it will be interesting to see. I wouldn't say that Brady said it didn't imply it was, the most drill sergeant type of practice or harsh or anything like that, but a little bit of a break from where it's been. And maybe the team needs a little bit of a break from where it's been in that regard. We also heard from Brady on the offensive line. I think one of the big pieces there is that they don't believe that the Abe Lucas injury is, quote, chronic. They feel like it's just going to take some time for him to rehab. It's taken a little longer than he thought, but that the prognosis, for at least from what he's hearing, is positive. And that is massively important for this offense overall. It's a huge, huge part of how this offense needs to perform. Thankfully, they've got George Fant, even if Abe Lucas takes a little while to fully get back up to speed, but they're just in a much, much better position at right tackle than they were last year. People forget the Seahawks spent a good chunk of the year with a 41-year-old Jason Peters playing right tackle. Another part of the year with Jake Curran, who was essentially the worst right tackle in the NFL by a wide margin when he played. It was just a very, very bad position last year. I think the other piece there, we heard from Brady, got to keep an eye on Anthony Bradford. Obviously, he was injured with an ankle and did not practice last week when they were watching. Is he going to be at right guard? Is he going to be at left guard? And I don't think we know that yet. The assumption was he'd stay at right guard, but Anthony Bradford did play left tackle even in his last year at LSU. Not a lot, but he played it for a couple of games. So he can play on the left side. We don't know that about the other guys. And so Laken Tomlinson is going to have competition. I don't believe Laken Tomlinson is going to just get a chance to play left guard with no pressure from any younger player on the roster. Maybe it's McClendon Curtis. Maybe it's Sato Lamea. Who knows? We will find out. But that's another question as we go through it. I was really happy to hear Brady mention, we have not talked to Ryan Grubb, the press corps, other than his opening press conference. I am dying to hear from Ryan Grubb and understand a little bit more about what his plans are, what his observations are, how he sees his personnel. And that's a huge, huge part of this equation going into this 2024 season. I would like to hear from Scott Huff as well. I think Scott Huff is a bigger part of this puzzle than I think is typically the case for a offensive line coach, but he may be as important as almost any other coach on this roster. And so I think that getting a chance to hear a little bit more from him, any insights from him would be really cool. And then we also heard from Brady that Gino Smith over the last 6 weeks of last season was the number one, not number 2, not number 10, number 1 QB by QBR in the NFL. And that coincided with him throwing the ball at a much faster rate. He was getting rid of the ball more quickly, which took the offensive line a little bit more out of the equation. I think that's a really important reminder. I talked about that at the end of last season, and I shared some of those numbers, even with Brady and Mitch on that show, that the Dallas game was a noticeable change in how Gino was approaching throwing the ball. He was getting rid of the ball so fast in that game, and he was managing to not just get rid of the ball fast, but do it for explosive plays. And that is a very rare combination. Generally, when you are a quick passer, you are of the Tom Brady variety, who most of your passes are quick, near the line of scrimmage, not more than 10 yards down the field kind of passes, because it takes the receivers a little bit of time to get down the field. So that is why, a 7-step drop takes longer than a 3-step drop, takes longer than a 5-step drop. And the reason you have these different drops is because you're letting longer or shorter routes develop. And so the fact that Gino Smith was able to create explosive plays and get rid of the ball quickly really got my attention last year. He was able to sustain it somewhat, but not quite. I mean, that Dallas game really stood out. I think it was maybe his best game overall as a Seahawk. And he's had some really good ones, but that one to me was just a fantastic performance. But if you can combine throwing the ball faster with an improved offensive line, and then you throw into that a better run game, now we're cooking. Now we're looking at something that potentially could start to scratch the surface of what I think a lot of us have seen as what should be a very powerful offense and just hasn't yet reached that in a sustained kind of way. I'm actually in the middle of I'm writing for the first time in a while. I was inspired by the show I did yesterday, the marathon 2-hour show I did yesterday on third downs. I'm going to consolidate a lot of the thoughts and observations and research that came out of that show and put together essentially a guidebook for how the Seahawks can turn around what has been really poor third down performance on offense and on defense and why it matters. And I think the path to doing that is right in front of them. And I don't think it's rocket science. So keep an eye out on hawkblogger.com. I will publish that hopefully today. It might take me till tomorrow, depending on what I do with the rest of my time, but going to publish that. I also want to tease. I am very excited about this. So everybody loves our crossover pod that we've been doing on Sundays with Rob Staten and Griff Sturgeon. And I had an idea and they've agreed to it. And I actually pulled in Jeff Simmons as well, because I think for this kind of show, 4 people will actually be better than 3. For the most part, I'm going to try to start changing to 3-person shows where possible. I think the conversations are better, but that's side note. Anyway, we are going to do an NFC West draft this Sunday. So if you thought the draft season was over, if you missed the mock drafts, if you want more of that, tune in Sunday. We are going to do an NFC West draft. What does that mean? There'll be more to come on that, but the basic idea is we are going to pick players from all 4 teams in the NFC West. We'll probably go for at least the top 50. We'll see how it goes time-wise and see where we end up with how many Seahawks are on that list. Where do they get drafted? Where are they relative to other guys in the NFC West? And we're going to do this not just with 2024 in mind, but over the next 3 years. And I'm really curious to see where we end up on that. It'll be a lot of fun. We'll do a snake style draft with the 4 of us, and we'll all come in there with our big boards, looking at the rosters and coming up with who we think are the top 50 players in the division. So keep an eye out for that this coming Sunday. And then we'll have more, obviously, every day. This is day 65 straight, I believe, for Hawk Blogger Mornings. We will have another episode of Real Hawk Talk coming up this week. We'll figure out what day, hopefully tomorrow, but we've got to match it up with when people are available. We'll take Patreon questions and so on. But appreciate all of you tuning in today. Thank you for especially YouTube members and patrons at patreon.com/hawkblogger. You guys are a huge part of making the show possible. Really appreciate it. If you haven't already, given the show a like and click subscribe, would appreciate that as well. We are in the dog days of NFL offseason. So really, really appreciate the support and anything you can do to share, tell other people about it, give it a 5-star rating, all the good stuff. Would really appreciate it. All right, folks, until I see you again, thank you. I am Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter and on Instagram at Hawk Blogger. This has been another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. Take care.